Hey, everybody. I am here today. We're so excited to bring you this free webinar tonight. I'm Megan Buer. I'm a certified emotion code practitioner and the founder over at Harmony Restored. And I am here today with Dr. Bush. He is the CEO of Biomic Sciences and Revolution Health Center, and he's got a really incredible background. So I'm going to actually just turn it over to him and let him introduce himself.
Very good. Thank you, Megan. We're really glad to be here with you today. It's a critical topic for so many of us as parents, and recent Mother's Day as well, reflecting on the challenges that it is to have a child who's not well, whether that's somebody with the flu, but then you'll start looking at chronic issues such as the spectrum disorder and everything else. It's just an incredible challenge. So delighted to be with you here today. There's a little bit of background on myself. I very much from a Western medicine training background and practice. I went through medical school at University of Colorado, and then came out to University of Virginia for a internal medicine residency program. I went on to be a chief resident, which is a faculty teaching position, for a year after that, and then went on to be accepted to the endocrinology and metabolism fellowship program at UVA, in which I studied and practiced the medicine of hormones. So a lot of care to bone disease, a lot of pituitary gland diseases that I was specializing in, Cushing's disease, other things, and then treating a lot of the typical diabetes, thyroid, autoimmune type conditions in clinic. So saw the whole gamut there during that time because of my work in the pituitary gland, got into tumor research and mechanisms of cancer, and actually developed a program that was developing chemotherapy for pituitary tumors and others. And so that really got me into research around how cancer forms and how you can treat it. I was working with these vitamin A compounds to kill tumors, and that was the beginning of my transformation from kind of the typical Western medicine-minded doctor to somebody who was starting to think, wow, maybe this food thing is actually kind of important, because this vitamin A compound coming out of carrots seems to do some pretty amazing things in the cancer world. So that was the beginning of some of my transformation. And then fortunately, Western medicine went into a collapse with the recession that we had 2007 to 2010. All the funding dried up, and so our huge department, we had the number 3 division of endocrinology in the world with 75 faculty, that dropped to 25 faculty over just 2 years. So huge collapse there. A lot of the funding for the university as a whole was drying up, and that forced me out. And so I started Revolution Health Center in 2010, and at that point I had studied nutrition intensively for about 1 or 2 years, because I'd started getting into it through both the chemotherapy thing as well as in the diabetes realm. And the clinic really opened in 2010 without me knowing what it was going to see. It's a relatively rural environment, town of 550 people that I started at the center in. And in that environment, I started to see everything walking in the door. And pretty quickly, because of our success, we were seeing people from all over the Eastern Seaboard, and pretty soon the whole United States, and pretty soon internationally, because very few people were figuring out how to apply nutrition to chronic disease management. And Western medicine has been forced, and all of us have been forced, to start to learn something about chronic disease management because of the epidemics that we currently have. The epidemics that we face are everything from type 2 diabetes, which is big out there, but really our topic today of anxiety and depression, I think, is one of the most profound epidemics that we have. So the whole gamut includes chronic fatigue, chronic pain syndromes, poor libido, poor sleep quality, brain fog, things that are affecting everybody, far from just the spectrum disorder. I think all of us can actually relate, at least one day a week, to what it feels like to have a semi-autistic brain, where we have a hard time with sensory processing, hard time with sleep quality, all kinds of typical spectrum disorder qualities we can all experience in different ways and forms.
Yeah. And I know for me, it was the anxiety and the depression. That was like the first signal, you know, in my body that something was off. And that's what I always do with my clients is, you know, that's the first thing. That's kind of like the first bell that goes off in the body. And then if we don't intervene at that point to really get people back on track, that's when all the other stuff starts to kind of snowball. I mean, I know that was my experience. And, you know, it's interesting the connection that we have. I'm actually a patient of yours, of Dr. Bush's. And he definitely saw me at my worst. You know, I was sick for a really long time before we came to you. So we live out in that tiny little town. And then this Revolution Health Center came in and I was like, what? Like this alternative minded doctor. I was so excited. And then we came and saw you and, you know, I was struggling, you know, it was bad. Like it started with the anxiety and the panic, and then it just kept snowballing into, you know, all the thyroid stuff and just all this insane fatigue that was just unexplainable. And, you know, I'd been working on myself and my diet was perfect and all these things for so long. And I just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. So, and then enter you.
Yeah. And I can definitely, you know, attest to the journey you were on. And it was very much your journey that was mimicked or followed by so many of my other patients that was actually drove us to the discovery of Restore. So we were seeing, you know, we were doing all kinds of, you know, plant-based diet, juicing protocols, things that had been proven to work since the 1960s. Yeah. And they weren't working. In a large part of our population, good 30-40% of our patients not responding to the nutrition like we would expect, you know, 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. And so we started to ask those questions of what's changed, what's different than all this incredible science we have from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so we were starting to ask questions about the plants themselves. What if the kale doesn't look like it is? And it didn't take long to figure out, oh my gosh, the tomatoes on the shelf or the kale on the shelf has a fraction of the nutrients it did in the 1950s, 60s. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of a no-brainer. And that took us down the path. Well, what happened in the soil? Is it a change in the plant or is it actually a change in the soil? Yeah. So that's when a colleague brought in a white paper on that soil science and really revealed the fact that, wow, there's something in that soil that can transform health. And so your experience, as sick as you got, really was speaking not to a weakness in your body. It was an environmental stress story more than anything else. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think there are so many people now that are doing everything right. You know, like you said, the healthy diet and all the supplements and, you know, they're exercising and they're meditating and they're, you know, they're doing all of these things and something isn't clicking. Like something is not working. And we hear so much about leaky gut. We hear so much about, you know, all of that stuff. And there's all these different restrictive diets that you can go on and all these things. And, you know, and I did all of that and nothing was really working. It was just bringing more stress into my life because, you know, every meal I made for my kids, they didn't eat. And, you know, just, it was really stressful. Yeah. And I just, again, kept getting sicker. And then, you know, I think it was really for me a combination of doing, bringing the Restore in and doing some of the things that you have told me to do, plus the emotional work, you know, releasing the stress, releasing all that type of that trauma is really what brought me to where I am. You know, those are the things, you know, that I attest to. And I mean, I have like an entire linen closet full of supplements, herbs, like everything. And the only thing I have on my counter is Restore because it's like, that's all I need. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Restore? I think first let's go back to your situation because I think it's just a perfect story. And then you can also talk towards your children as well because our children's generation is getting hit much harder than our generation. But to go back to your story and think about its timeline, you mentioned anxiety and depression were the very first signs, the panic attack, anxiety of this downward cycle or decline that would ultimately become a profound fatigue state. And in our clinic, we use something called a GDV camera, which images the energy field. And when we first took your images, it was about 60% absent. There was really no energy field being generated by the deeper life force there. And we see that frequently now where there's been such a chronic depletion going on in the system where we are no longer emanating that life force, like solar flare kind of energy that we should be putting out. And we experience from that a real shutdown of multiple systems. Mm-hmm. What's going on there is really important. And this goes back to my very earliest research back in like 1998 and stuff. Before I even ended up at UVA, I was starting to get really interested in something called psychoneuroendocrinology. That's a very small niche in the world of science, but it's an interesting one in that you're saying that there's an effect of hormones on the neural system, which then leads to the mood disorders. And so that background was already in the late 1990s starting to point its fingers not at some sort of developmental issue or abuse as a child or all these things that we had historically thought of being risk factors for anxiety, depression, etc. Instead, it was pointing at one thing, which was inflammation. Mm-hmm. And inflammation, as it turns out, is really the hallmark or the foundation of every chronic disease that we see in America. And so everything from that anxiety disorder to infertility to type 2 diabetes out to the heart disease and cancer, all of those underlying processes are a chronic inflammatory process. In the brain, it's an amazing process. There's a tiny little structure out in the temporal lobe, right up near your ear, that is called the hippocampal formation. And that has two important parts to it. It almost looks like a thumb. You can picture it as a thumb with the nail of the thumb being the hippocampus. And that's where you do short-term memory processing and start to log it out to long-term memory. Around it is a thin strip of tissue that is called the amygdala. And that's where the intense emotions are processed. So rage, fear, anxiety, panic, all of those are misfirings or dysfunction of that tiny little tissue rim around your memory center called the amygdala. And when chronic inflammation happens, it really starts by signaling changes right in the middle of the brain, which is the hypothalamus signaling to the pituitary gland. And this hypothalamic pituitary axis is actually what triggers the beginning of a stress response. And when that hypothalamus starts to constantly be hit with stress, it starts to fuel an inflammatory process that shrinks this temporal lobe structure. And as we start to see shrinkage of that structure, our very first symptom is anxiety, then panic attack, then if not fixed, major depression can really set in big. And right in that phase between the anxiety and the depression is usually when the fatigue syndromes start. And that's usually with a fractured sleep pattern. You start to log a huge sleep debt. With the sleep debt comes further depletion of the system. It screws up sleep-wake cycles, but it also screws up the way in which you handle calories. All kinds of different things start to happen. And so the depletion effect is profound and common. Mm-hmm. And the reason is really getting at how, again, we can tell the American story. You were asking, how come you were able to get rid of, a huge closet full of supplements and put one thing on the counter? How is that possible? How can one thing be more powerful than 1,000 things? The answer has to do a lot with our environment again. In the 1940s, we were growing 45% of the American food chain in our backyard victory gardens. I say we as if I was living then. I may look that old today, but that was my grandparents' generation, raising 45% of the food chain in their backyards. The soil was thriving in the backyard garden, but on the large scale, it was actually pretty depleted. You remember we're coming out of the Dust Bowl, 1930s, all of that, right before the war started. Then the war starts, we focus all our attention on the war. We still have pretty poor macro kind of grand agricultural scale activity going on at the end of World War II. We're heavily reliant on people producing their own food at that point. Then at the end of the war, we had this huge glut of petroleum, and we decided we could take that petroleum and turn it into nitrogen fertilizers. And so we started spraying nitrogen petroleum-based fertilizers on our crops, and it was like a miracle. We took all this dried out, dead topsoil from the Midwest and turned it right back into this living soil that was generating green crops again. And it allowed us to start what would be called the Green Revolution, which was really the beginning of mass factory farming that we have today. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is it was really a Band-Aid rather than a fix. And so when you just spray nitrogen into the crops, you can get a green plant, but it doesn't mean you have other micronutrients in there.
Mm-hmm.
Because we weren't doing the thousands of years of soil management that had been practiced historically, and we were just spraying petroleum-based stuff on there, we weren't getting the amazing selenium and manganese and all these amazing little peptides that needs to be in the food. And so we started growing depleted foods that looked green. They looked pretty, but they didn't have the nutrient density and nutrient variety we needed. Interestingly, when you start to raise plants that are nutrient deficient, they become very disease prone. That sounds a lot like the human. You start to lose your nutrient base, you become prone to sickness and illness. Same with the plant. And so with that, we had to start developing all kinds of herbicides and pesticides to manage these sick plants. And so you can almost picture it as an ICU type environment developing slowly in the plant kingdom, where we were developing more and more artificial environment for the food that we would eat. Now today we have such an extreme version of that, where many of the tomatoes grown, et cetera, are actually grown not even in soil. They're grown in hydroponic water systems that never touch the soil. They add a few critical nutrients and they create a red tomato, but the lycopene, for example, which is that cancer-killing component of a tomato, is nearly absent. And so it's very interesting to see the correlation. It started with our plants losing life force, losing nutrient density. And as we did that, we got more and more desperate for chemicals that were going to address the issue. And in 1976, we adopted a chemical called glyphosate. This was actually patented by a company named Monsanto that everybody's heard of as an antibiotic, not as an herbicide. It functions as an antibiotic because of its mechanism of being able to block critical enzyme sequestration of nutrients. And so it kills any sort of living force, whether it's a bacteria or a plant, by tying up critical nutrients. And so it's almost like a big chelator that grabs up all the nutrients and you can't get them to the plant, and the plant dies. And so that antibiotic became an herbicide, and we started spraying it around to kill weeds. If we sprayed it on a crop, it would kill the crop. And so that was kind of sparingly used. And then in the 1980s, we went direct to consumer with that chemical in the form of Roundup. And so they got permission from the EPA to sell Roundup to the general consumer, and suddenly every Lowe's, Home Depot, home gardening center was full of these huge containers of Roundup. Unfortunately, homeowners are nowhere near as judicious as maybe a farmer who's got a tight bottom line to take care of, and the homeowner started dumping this stuff in pretty inordinate quantities down their driveways to kill a few weeds in the cracks. It would wash down into our municipal water systems, and by the end of the 80s, we were drinking glyphosate without even realizing what it was. Then in 1992, a big shift happened in mega farming. And so 1992 was when Roundup started to be used to actually kill a food crop. And that was in the world of wheat. And so in 92, we took on the practice of using it as what's called a desiccant, but it's really just to kill it. Using it as a desiccant or a ripening agent was the marketing technique of Monsanto. And we were able to spray wheat and kill it early. The reason we would do that is so that the northern climate farmers could get 2 crops out of every growing season. So they don't have to wait for the wheat to grow tall, mature, and then dry out, and then harvest. They could just speed up that process by, as soon as it went into a seed form, they could spray it, kill it, it would dry out in 3 days, and they could harvest it. And so we started shipping to market, both to our animals and to humans, wheat that was sprayed with this glyphosate content. Every year since 1992, we have gone up by anywhere from 50 to 100-fold the number of acres sprayed with that worldwide. In 1996, again, a huge paradigm shift happened. 1996, we created the genetically modified crop. And you remember that used to be called Roundup Ready crops. Monsanto has wisely changed their marketing on that. Now they just call it GMO, genetically modified organism. But those were genetically modified to do nothing but withstand Roundup, so that the whole crop could be sprayed with Roundup and it wouldn't kill the corn, it would just kill the weeds. That was a huge change for the farmer. The farmer was no longer having to weed their fields, is a pretty big deal. And so these genetically modified crops suddenly allowed farms to again expand from 10,000 acres to 100,000 acres in this massive expansion with just a few handful of employees working this massive plot of land, because It all comes down to driving giant tractors and spray machines or spraying from the air this chemical glyphosate. And so that era really ushered in what we see in your story, Megan, is that you were not somebody who was making poor life decisions. You were not somebody spending your time eating fast food or drinking soda. You were somebody who was really eating in the top 2-3% of the country as far as the selections and choices you were making, and yet you were getting sicker and sicker and with no explanation of what was going on. You see doctors, they do blood tests, they say, oh, everything looks okay, or maybe your thyroid's a little off, but a little bit off on thyroid never accounts for the disaster that's going on in the system.
Yeah.
And so that's where the story of Restore really comes in, is that we are one of the first groups to really tease out the science of all of that farming history in our agricultural environment and its impact on human health. Is this a good moment for me to show a picture?
Yeah, this would be great. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and show a picture with you guys here because Megan really brought up the critical story here of what it looks like to have leaky gut. And I'm going to show you leaky gut here under the microscope. Under the microscope, can you see the slide there, Megan?
Yep.
Up here in the top left, you're going to see a control membrane. This is human small bowel grown under a microscope. And you've got the green lines lighting up something called the tight junction. These are Velcro-like proteins that tie one cell to the next cell. And they're critical in the absorption and intelligent absorption of compounds from the gut. If you look to the right, we've added now 10 parts per million of glyphosate to this membrane. That's the amount that the EPA allows in beets that are on the grocery store shelf and things like that. So even in your plant crops, you're seeing commonly this 10 parts per million number. You can see that all the cells have fallen apart, and this happens very quickly. Within 16 minutes of introduction, 16 minutes, you're already seeing this collapse. And within 8 hours, 12 hours, 18 hours, you see a massive devastation to the membrane. You lose as much as kind of 40% or more of the membrane integrity over that period of time. Now, the excitement is that, so actually I should say that this is being, this process here is not just local. This is not just occurring at the gut membrane. The tight junctions that you see here highlighted in green are also responsible for the integrity of the membranes in the blood vessels, the blood-brain barrier, the kidneys. Throughout your whole body, you're dependent on these tight junctions to keep coherent membrane. And so when you start to see this widespread damage, you're not just losing gut integrity, which is now going to expose your immune system that lies right behind that membrane. You're also losing vascular capacity, you're losing blood-brain barrier, you're losing kidney clearance. And so you're really becoming just a sponge for toxin. And that can also just be naturally occurring compounds that aren't even man-made that shouldn't have gotten into the system. Things like insoluble fiber from your plant foods and stuff like that. Those shouldn't get into the system. They should be kept in aluminum paths with your bowel movement. But instead, we start absorbing all kinds of things that we should not be exposed to. The immune system now goes into total overwhelm, and you get chronic inflammation set up very quickly. I want to show you then with Restore. What is Restore? Restore is the little molecule we found in the soil science. The reason I discovered it or recognized its potential was because it looked a lot like the chemotherapy I was producing at the University of Virginia. And that was the sudden realization of, oh my gosh, what is that doing in soil? And what it looked like was a communication network. And communication networks down in the biochemical environment are now being recognized to be highly reliant on something called redox molecules. These are positive and negative charge molecules. And those redox molecules are the cell-cell signaling environment that help one cell talk to the next. And so we discovered a new form of those redox molecules that are not made by the human body, not made by the mitochondria inside the human body, but made by bacteria. And that was the huge shift. And that was the huge connection that was suddenly plugged in a whole bunch of science that at the time from UCLA and UCSD were saying, wow, if you have screwed up bacteria in your gut, you get these diseases in the human. If you have these bacteria underrepresented, you get anxiety, or these underrepresented, you get cancer, or these underrepresented or too much of, you get heart disease. So we were starting to make these connections between the bacteria and systemic disease, but this was really the link of how that might happen. There is a communication network being produced by your bacteria. Each bacteria makes a different population of these carbon molecules. And you can almost picture them as snowflakes, each one slightly different shape, different binding sites, different function. If you have 30,000 species, you have a very fluent communication network. But if you only have a fraction of that number of species in your gut, you're walking around with a truncated or abbreviated vocabulary, and you don't have all the pieces and tools you need to do fluent communication between the cells. And so if you look at the slide, we'll close with this thought on my side, and then we'll turn over to Megan's incredible journey on the energy side. And I think the two really put together, because down here you see Restore with these carbon molecules being put onto the membranes. In the bottom right, you can see actually an increase in the number of tight junctions. Hard to capture maybe with the quality of this image on your screen, but there's about a 20 to 30% increase even from your healthy control. When you put Restore on, don't end up where you were. You actually got better than you were before. Now, if you take a membrane that's been exposed to glyphosate and has fallen apart and you add Restore, it zippers right back together. Similarly, if you take your control membrane, add Restore at the same time that you hit it with glyphosate, you never see the fall apart happen. And so it acts as an antidote down there at the tissue level to this glyphosate phenomenon. And it supports those tight junctions and their integrity up to huge, huge quantities of glyphosate. We've now studied up to 20,000 times the EPA allowable levels in food, and you continue to get these cells to zipper shut. So extremely powerful tool to keep these zippered shut. This is the leaky gut kind of phenomenon that Megan had mentioned earlier. When cells start falling apart, you get leak. This is the opposite of leak here. And again, it's not because Restore is a medication, it's not a drug effect, it's simply communication. And so when the cells have access to communication, they are capable of an incredible rate of repair. And that's really what's happening with Restore, is it's simply returning the communication network, and the body's going into this massive natural repair state and protection state that should exist in all of us. So that's how we discovered that. And this ties into Megan's journey now and her critical work, because when you start to lose this membrane, you start to literally lose self-identity. At the cell level, you're losing self-identity when the membranes fall apart. The body can no longer tell what's outside and what's inside, what is outside world, what is inside world, what is exterior, and what is self. That breakdown at the cell level, we see mimicked again and again, or paralleled in the macro state of the human experience and the spirit there. We are literally turning into these beings that have lost our sense of purpose, our sense of connectivity to self, our sense of grounding. And that's where we start to become very vulnerable to emotional trauma, social stressors, social financial stressors. All those start to have an impact that I don't think would exist if we all had tight membranes all the time and had a very clear sense of exterior, interior, outside self. And if we had that really solid, I don't think we'd be in nearly the state we are. But unfortunately, we are in this leak state as a population. And that's where we start to see this huge accumulation of what I think was your discovery, Megan. Why don't you take us into that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to see kind of the work I do on that cellular level there, because, I mean, it's all mind-blowing. Everything you just said is blowing my mind. But, I think for what I see, the clients that come to me, they come to me with a laundry list of different things. So, they've got autoimmune stuff, they've got cancer, they've got, whatever, or a runny nose. I mean, anything in between. And what I am seeing always is that there's always an underlying factor of either anxiety or depression. So they go through this whole list and they say, yep, I've got this and this, and I've got this pain in my hip, and I've got, all these things. Oh, and I'm anxious. Oh, and I'm depressed. And it's always there for everybody. And it's like, that's kind of the base of what was going on. That's what started, was the anxiety or the depression, and I end up talking to my clients a lot about being, leaky, in a sense, where they just take on everybody's stress. They, everything is stressful, everything is overwhelming, and they just take it on like it's their own, and it becomes them. And a lot of times they're stressed out, they're in pain, they have all these things wrong with them, and it's not even their own stuff. It's like everybody else's stress that they've just been piling and piling onto them, and they're just carrying it around. And then they start to, that starts to manifest in the physical body. And so I actually say that, I say there's a spectrum where like you're a total robot and you don't feel anything. And, and then there's the other end where you're just like fluid and open and everybody throws their stuff on you. And then we just get so, they can just get so anxious and depressed around these stresses that aren't even theirs. And, and I tell them like, we've got to make those boundaries. And so now we're looking at it on your end. It's boundaries on every level, from the gut to the emotions. And, and then when we make those boundaries, when that's strong, then we can take care of ourselves. And, everybody talks about self-care now, but we can't really do that until we're balanced ourselves. Like we have to be grounded and centered. And that's when we can really start to, to make progress on the emotional side of it. So it's just
that's perfect. And I think what you see is the doctors add into that. And so, on one level, the patient is picking up on, like you say, the emotional issues of family members or community members or whatever it is. But then they walk into the doctor's office and they start being handed diagnoses. Mm-hmm. It starts to sound like they are more of a pile of medical problems than they are a human being. Mm-hmm. And you get happen in their speech, both in the doctor's speech as well as the patient's speech. I am a diabetic.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that should never be said. No, you are not a diabetic. You are you.
Yeah.
You may have diabetes, but you are not a diabetic. To describe yourself as I am a diabetic or I am a breast cancer, no. You are, I am Zach.
Yeah.
I may have a condition I'm dealing with, but I am Zach. And that I work so hard every day with my patients to help them make that shift away from their disease identification. I am a celiac patient. Mm-hmm. I have celiac, I am gluten sensitive. It's so insidious how the boundaries start to break down and we become the problem.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I tell people that don't own it. It's not yours, even in my, my ebook, Keys to Calm, I say that like, anxiety is not who you are. Like, don't own it. It's something you're feeling and it's something that's moving through. It's a signal and that's great, but it's not who you are. And even things like I'm tired, I'm stressed, I'm guilty of that. I need to watch my mouth when I say that, but that's where it starts, saying I'm stressed out, I'm tired, I'm this, that, and the other. And then bam, you're in the doctor's office. And now now I have Hashimoto's. Now so it's those words that we put after I am and how powerful they are on not just the emotional side of our bodies, but the physical side of our bodies, that it just makes a huge, huge impact in well-being. So, that was good insight too.
I love that. And I think that the journey that we're having, both together now and watching your clinical practice take off, I've sent so many patients to you and seen your work in so many different ways. But one of the refreshing things about both, the gut health and restore, as well as the emotional healing that we see you working in, the cool thing is how passive it is. Mm-hmm. I love this. It's not something that the person has to go and start building better character or make better decisions about their lives. Or like you said, you and so many others have been making so many difficult and really, ultimately expensive decisions for their health, picking to buy the healthy food, choosing to, do the right things at the supplement counter, whatever it is, and yet they aren't sticking. When you find the tools that are getting at the root cause of your problem, everything shifts. Mm-hmm. And all of those good decisions you're making day in and day out can suddenly stick. And certainly that's the case. That's how you went from a whole closet full of supplements, herbal therapies, homeopathy to one supplement, as actually you already had all the tools in your body to be healthy at the biologic level. You were just lacking the communication that would put a cell into a healing state. Mm-hmm. You were lacking the communication that would put up a protective barrier and simply say outside, inside. All those barriers go back up, and you'd spend all those years feeding your body the right things. Mm-hmm. And so you were actually very prepared to go into a healing state, and you did. And similar to your situation, where when you start to do emotion code or you teach somebody the tools for emotion code therapy, it's suddenly a passive process where they had been doing all the meditation, they'd been doing the positive affirmations, they'd been doing the visualizations, they'd been doing. And so when the barriers go back up and you can get, remove the emotion from keeping that little channel open, I really see it very similar in your work. Is you're finding these emotions trapped in the immune system or in the neurologic system or in the spleen or liver system or whatever it is. Those are like these little wedges that keep this pathway opened up. It keeps the boundaries from being there. You remove that, suddenly the healthy barrier goes back up and you can get it. And the reverse is also the case. You're often finding in my patients these heart walls. These are kind of emotional barriers that children will put up, and we will put up in ourselves as children to protect ourselves. And we build them out of incredible materials, concrete, steel, all these figurative materials that we use to protect ourselves. Mm-hmm. The body does the same thing. When it's under stress and it's being overwhelmed and everything's leak and everything's exposure, it starts to do the same thing. It starts to build calluses and fibrous tissue and scar and all of this stuff. And it's really similar process in the emotional realm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
and so I think it's very funny and so encouraging that, my gosh, it's passive. The healing process is not more effort, more work. Right. Because if it was, we'd be screwed because we're all fatigued and underslept and exhausted. If it really required more effort, we'd pretty much be
well, and that's where I was, and I know so many of my clients and my readers, like that's where they are. And I just remember doing everything perfect and feeling, I had spent, I don't even want to know how much money on Amazon on like books, just researching, trying to figure out what the heck was going on in my body. And I was just exhausted, and my kids were sick and I was sick, and it was just like, what is going on? And so I started to think, there's something wrong with me. And then I start to internalize, okay, there must, none of this is working. So there must be something wrong with me. And then that belief, holding that belief in my body starts to, the snowball keeps going, and going. And then it was really, I came to you. And I mean, I just remember my husband was actually talking about this morning, when we took those images and, you came back in the room and you were like, oh my gosh, like I heard that you're tired, but like, I hear a lot of people say that, but now to see like such a huge depletion in your body, to be in that place where I could barely get off the couch to take care of my kids. I was in and out of emergency rooms for panic attacks. I mean, it was all of that to just, once I brought in the restore and the emotional work, these tools to deal with my anxiety, these emotional things that we just didn't grow up learning. We didn't learn how to deal with our emotions. We just, our parents didn't want to deal with it. No offense. But they didn't want to deal with it. And we didn't know how to, like, we think when we feel anxiety or we feel anger, there's something wrong, when it's just a communication. And so dealing with those emotional things, the emotion code, releasing the emotions on that cellular level, but also things like EFT and just different things to support the body. Once I incorporated those two things, that's when like everything it was like, bam, done, and I tell my clients this all the time. When the body heals, it heals everything. Yeah. So if they come to me again with a laundry list of 1,000 different things they want to work on, it's like, it's all the same thing. Like if there's no, your headache is completely related to your digestive issues and vice versa. And so let's work on one thing, but we're healing everything all at the same time, And so it's just really interesting to see the connection between the physical gut lining and the emotional well-being, in a person. So, yeah.
Perfect. It's so well said. And it's interesting, I think that oftentimes, like in your case, where you actually on the surface looked healthy, you were doing so many things right, mm-hmm. that you were able to basically palliate or kind of create the appearance of health despite this utter collapse. And so you were one of my many patients where we'd actually go ahead and do it at GDB image, take a look at your energy field, and it would tell a story that was so much more dramatic and so much more desperate than you looked on the surface. But what you felt every day was not how you looked, it was how you actually were underneath the surface. And so this has become a huge problem in the medical field, where you walk in with complaints about yourself to a doctor's office, or you have a child that you sense this stuff going on in, and you walk in the doctor's office. They look at you or look at your child and like, looks healthy, do some lab work, looks healthy, and that's it. And so there's this huge lack of trust that suddenly gets formed on many levels. A, you stop believing your doctor, you must be an idiot because I don't feel well, and B, you didn't listen to me. And so there's that issue. But ultimately, it also develops a huge mistrust in your own body, where you start to question yourself, like, am I really feeling this stuff?
Yeah.
Is it valid?
I'm making it up. Yeah.
And just huge insecurity of like, and you start to actually doubt your own intuition, and that's a dangerous moment.
Yeah.
Especially when the doctors go and say, no, you don't have anything wrong, you need to ignore your intuition. That's a dramatic societal problem right there.
Yeah. I mean, I had so many people tell me that, and so then I finally start thinking, okay, maybe it is just me. Like it's in my head, so I was on and off medications all the time. Every doctor I saw, it was just like, no, everything looks fine. You're good. I'm like, no, I'm not good. Like something is going on.
Yeah.
And then to finally walk in your door, and it was like, somebody's listening. And that, again, I was just kind of reliving some of it this morning with my husband. And he's like, do you remember like when we left Zach's office that first time? He's like, we walked in the parking lot and you started bawling because you were like, somebody heard me. Like somebody actually said, yeah, there is something going on here, not just like, oh, you're a mom and, you're tired and that's normal. So you try to take a nap. It's like, no. Something is going on. I need more than a nap here. And I mean, naps are great, but yeah.
And the journey's been long. It's important for everybody to realize that, Megan's been on her healing journey for years. And I think all of us, I really, I've told so many of my patients that I was the first patient in my clinic. I was the first patient to be healed through my clinic. Mm-hmm. I had huge depression by the time I started my clinic. I'd been practicing medicine for 8 years. My patients were crashing, not getting better. I just saw people getting sicker and sicker. I was starting to realize I'd been handed an enormously erroneous and truncated or ineffective toolbox to do what I had set out to do, which was try to help humans and help improve health. And I was getting very depressed on the professional level. And then, of course, financial disaster hit, and I watched my mentors of years simply just close their doors. I mean, nobody could help me. Nobody was interested in helping me maintain my academic career that I had worked for 17 years and a whole house mortgage worth of debt of school loans. Suddenly all that was upon me. And I was, also unbeknownst, I was developing the same leaky membranes. I was, eating the things I shouldn't eat. And even though I thought I was eating healthy, I was eating, the organic meat or whatever. And I thought that was good. I was drinking more skim milk and things like that, not knowing that was a disaster. And I was just trying to make smart decisions, not knowing what it was. But I had the underlying leak going on. I had depression developing. And so by the time I started my clinic, I was in a pretty bad state. I was having, a really big crisis. I was actually having suicidal thoughts. I was having all kinds of difficulty connecting with my own 2 kids, not feeling love for them. I was just really in a desperate state. And it was really through the work of starting to understand nutrition deeper and deeper that really got me back on track. But it was also largely from the experience of just working with humans that were all similarly intentioned. And, you get a bunch of patients that go to a place called Revolution Health Center. That's not people looking for the status quo. And so I had the delightful experience of actually coming into community with my own patients for the first time. Mm-hmm. And this is an aha moment, I think, for our field of medicine, is we have the wrong community. We've created this community of doctors who see themselves totally separate from their patients, and they have no, sense of compassion or belonging, and they certainly don't look to their patients for education. They certainly are not looking to their patients for information. And I have been absolutely taught more by my patients in the last 6 years than any medical textbook would have ever taught me.
Yeah.
You guys, as a community of people who are dedicated to health and finding every avenue to it, are a much more fascinating academic environment than one of pharmaceutical academia. So really intriguing to see just the effect of community. And I think that, you and I are a good example of that, Megan, where you came in as a patient, but now 6 years later, close friends, love your kids, you love my family, over there for taco dinners or whatever it is. It's just like so important that we start to let down our artificial boundaries or our scar tissue boundaries and start letting our healthy boundaries lead to healthy selves that can then exercise our self-identity through community interaction.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the futures. And this is actually, I think, Megan, exactly what you're doing with your ebook and everything else is, and I'm so glad you're hooked up with Thinking Moms Revolution now. That 40,000 mothers of autistic children around the world, ultimately the things that's going to heal us is that community more than any, medical breakthrough. And so what you're doing for getting information out there, bringing education, but also just opening up avenues for more and more community, more and more communication and trust in one another in this community. That's really where it's going to be built.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think this is all fascinating, and I think people are really going to connect with these stories of, everybody knows somebody who's got an autoimmune disease or cancer or allergies or, who's gluten intolerant or whatever, has anxiety or depression. If you don't, somebody that does, and it's like everybody in the world can use this,
Absolutely.
Just healing our guts and healing our emotions and getting these tools to really handle stress on a physical and an emotional level. That's how we're going to change people's lives. And, I know for me, when I have been sitting down to write this ebook, it's like, what did I wish I would have had 10 years ago when I was totally overwhelmed, panicking, anxious, just had those first real red flags go off in my body that inflammation's happening, something's going on here, something's off. What did I wish I would have had, instead of spending 10 years sick and researching and jumping from doctor to doctor and spending a gazillion dollars trying to figure it all out. What did I wish I would have had, and so in that book, I just go through, obviously Restore is a huge part of my healing. And it still is, I still take it every day. My kids take it every day. And, my 10-year-old on the spectrum, he can eat whatever he wants as long as he has his Restore. He can go eat, gluten and all that kind of stuff. As long as he has his Restore, he's totally fine. It's no big deal, and he knows that. He intuitively knows that. And he's like on it. Like every day it's like, where's my Restore? So it's things like the Restore, obviously, but the emotional healing tools, these things that when I was a kid, I never would have thought, were important. We don't understand the importance of our emotions and our thoughts and, having these tools, tapping and the emotion code and these different grounding tools and all that kind of stuff to just stay balanced, to keep those boundaries strong, to keep ourselves, centered in the world of a lot of overwhelming stress. That's what I wish I would have had, is somebody to simplify it and say, okay, rather than spending 10 years continuing to get sicker and trying all these crazy diets and restricting your food and, spending $1 bazillion on supplements and herbs and doctors and naturopaths and here's the answer. Don't worry about all that. Here's what you need to start with. It's just healing the emotions and drink your Restore.
It's fantastic. And your book and your journey, I think, will heal many more people than I can as a doctor. Because ultimately, because we've reached this crisis state where doctors are pretty much rejecting the patient's reports and their beliefs and their experiences and telling them, no, there's been such a rupture of trust in there that I really believe it's these communities. I've certainly seen it working this way in Thinking Moms Revolution and everything else, is that when a mother of a spectrum disorder child comes along and says, this is what's working for us, that has such a huge clout compared to some doctor sitting around showing science slides and speaking a bunch of theoretical science. So the experience of healing is one that's far more powerful than any science I can ever sit and talk about. So the ebook that you've got coming is so exciting for me that it's far beyond the need for science. It's mostly about the need for experience. And here's a woman who's had the experience. And I think it's worthwhile just for a moment to reflect on your experience, not just for your own journey of anxiety and depression and panic disorder and then chronic fatigue and the rest, the autoimmune disease that then followed. All of that was classic leak.
Mm-hmm.
But then on top of that, you have a generational issue where you had mentioned our parents earlier, our parents' generation, and then parents' generation before that, parents' generation before that. It's been literally thousands of years, I think, since we've, as a species, been really connected in a healthy way to nature. Ever since Western civilization started, we've been marching away from nature and trying to engineer more and more microenvironments that are less and less healthy, less and less in touch with our own original nature. Mm-hmm. And so this generational impact has put higher and higher stress levels with every generation. But because of the advancement of technology and the ways in which we've applied it to our environment over the last 40 years, never has there been such a dramatic generation to generation jump. Mm-hmm. And so your generation is really, under the gun right now, because as mothers in your generation, you guys are facing the highest rates of, spectrum disorder children that have ever been experienced. And this is on logarithm scales. I mean, this isn't like a slight increase. Where these massive epidemic of the sensory processing disorders in our children is coming at the exact moment where your generation is the first to be hit with the epidemic of anxiety and depression as an adult. Mm-hmm. And so you take a whole population of women who are now being faced with anxiety, panic, chronic fatigue, autoimmune disease, and then give them the most highly intensive, child population that has ever existed. And then you also add to it the largest geriatric patient population that's ever existed that they're going to have to take care of. Our generation is not looking good as far as just the sheer amount of chaos control that we're going to have to do. And so this is where I think, I reach out to every mom, and just breaks my heart that, our decisions as a society, or whether it's our farming decisions, the chemicals we use in the farming or the chemicals we use in medical clinics or whatever it is, this whole pharmaceutical chemical lifestyle, convenience lifestyle living that we've developed, it's the mothers and children that are paying the price. It's extraordinarily unfair. And not to say that dads aren't exhausted too, but my gosh, the nurture gene there is so strong in the mother. And when a child is not well, what a stressor it is, and what an incredible frustration when oftentimes society points back to you as a mom and says, well, you must have done something pretty messed up for your kid to turn out like that. No, it's a societal decisions that led to the toxicity that would injure our children to this degree. Mm-hmm. And so it's just a vicious cycle. And I'm just so eager and pleased that you're part of this community that's growing to say, not our fault. Simple solutions that don't require more effort, because God knows you don't have more effort to give. You've already given 1,000%. There's got to be solutions there that are easy to put into practice that lead to this passive healing process to take back over. What good news that our bodies heal.
Yeah.
That's when I started to really get marginalized in the Western medicine environment, when I started giving lectures at UVA that included the word healing. That was very uncomfortable for that medical community here. Nobody wants to hear about healing. It sounds too woo-woo, a little bit out there, new agey, maybe a little hippie in there or something going on. But what the heck? When did we as doctors stop believing in our capacity to heal? I mean, the body is healing constantly, daily, every day, and to its strength. The healing process strengthens bones, strengthens tissue, strengthens brain, all kinds of stuff. When did we stop believing in it? And that was a real tragedy for our industry. So I congratulate you.
Thanks. I mean, that is my whole mission, is to just let people exhale. Like, you are doing a great job. You are totally incredible. And you're healing right now. Like, this minute, your body is healing. Like, there is nothing wrong with you. And that's where this journey of like natural health, and it just got so overwhelming. And I just was going down this spiral of like, there's something wrong with me and I need to fix it. And it's the next diet and it's the next herb and it's the next, and I finally was like, no, everything's okay. Yeah. There's actually nothing wrong with me. And that's, people come to me, either through my products or my blog or my clients, and they really they hold this belief there's something wrong with them and their body doesn't know how to heal itself. And that's the biggest lie. And, I want to help simplify moms' lives and other people's lives that, you're doing a great job and there's nothing wrong with you, that you have the ability to heal. There's just a few extra tools that don't take much effort that you can implement. I mean, you talked about the connection to nature. I mean, even just that, I tell clients that every day on the phone. I'm like, just go outside. Like, I know it sounds so simple and you want this magic pill and you want it to be some big complicated secret, but I was like, take your shoes off and go outside. Like, I'm not kidding. Yes. That is the secret. It's like, yes, right under your nose. Like, you have everything you need to heal right inside of your body and right outside your back door. And and so we've made it so complicated, and it just doesn't have to be, and just when you feel that anxiety or that depression or that headache or whatever is signaling in your body, just take a minute to breathe and go outside and like touch the earth, like put your hands on the ground or touch a tree and like just reconnect. And it can really be that simple. And so, like, let's take the confusion out of everybody's health and just, simplify it and make people feel better. That's what they just want to feel better. And they can, so yeah.
I love it. I think that you, like I, same thing in my clinic every day. The power of the earth. Mother Earth is there to absorb all of those stressors, right? And, the ocean is one of those classic environments where you can feel that. The ocean has such an incredible power, and there's something about the slap of the waves on the beach that lets your body, it seems to give a subconscious permission to the body to give it all back, give all the stress, give all of the, self, internalized beliefs and stressors back away, give them back to nature, give them back up again. And I think nature and Mother Earth are really inviting us to do that on a daily basis. And so developing that routine experience of being in the sunshine, being, in the fog bank, breathing rain, all of these things are just such beauties that, instead we huddle under umbrellas and dash to the car and things like that, we forget what it tastes like to have, rain on your tongue. Never mind that 75% of the rain on Earth right now is glyphosate in it. But
take your Restore before you drink.
Go enjoy the rain shower.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been wonderful. I think we could probably talk for like another 5 hours, but we will. So for people, if they want to find out more about Restore and what you do, where can they go to find that?
So we have a website. It's easy to find. It's got a lot of the science behind it. Some of the images you saw today, and then there's a time-lapse video that shows you just how fast glyphosate in a normal diet of 10 parts per million will destroy the gut membrane, and the protection of it is on there with a time-lapse video and stuff. So the website is restore4life.com, restore4life.com, and you'll find it there. And what about your websites?
Yeah. So harmony-restored.com is my website. I've got a blog on there. So there's tons of free resources, exercises for people. If you're feeling anxiety, there's lots of stuff on there that you can just go do. It's for free right there. I see clients, I do the emotion code, and I also have an e-course about food and sugar and transforming that relationship, making peace with your food. I have one ebook out right now that's called The Handbook for Healing, and that's all about my journey with the autoimmune stuff and the fatigue and the food intolerances, and really simplifying, like taking all these bite-sized pieces, making it bite-sized for people, taking the overwhelm out of health. And then I have Keys to Calm, which is coming out this week. It's all about healing anxiety. So all the tools that I use to heal, shyness as a kid, anxiety turned panic, turned everything else. So all the tools, simplifying all that stuff that I wish I would have known 10 years ago into one little ebook.
So exciting. Such a powerful tool.
Yeah.
Shorter the better. We are too tired to read long books. So.
Exactly. Nobody's got time for that. And, it's interactive. There's lots of videos and things, exercises for people to just get feeling better right away and, clear the brain fog and all that stuff. So, yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, Megan, thanks for your time and invite. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye.
Best of health to all of you listening.
All right. Bye-bye.